everyone, welcome to No Spin. Today, let's talk about the history of the first Marxist government ever put in place, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also called the Soviet Union. The formation of the USSR really began in 1898, with the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party being created. The RSDLP was a group of mostly working-class individuals and was based on the works of philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels believed the class conflict due to the intensifying contradictions between the bourgeois, who owned the means of production, the minority, and the vast majority of the population, the proletariat, who produced goods and services, in capitalism would cause social change, thus a proletarian revolution that would establish a socialist government then give way to a communist stage of social development. Anyways, back to the RSDLP. In 1903, the group split into two due to the differences in thought of the two leaders, Vladimir Lenin and Julius Martov, yet still stayed united under the same name. The Bolsheviks, derived from the Russian word for majority, were led by Lenin, and the Mensheviks, derived from the Russian word for minority, were led by Martov, which is a little confusing considering there was less Bolsheviks than there were Mensheviks. 2 years later, in 1905, the Russian Revolution began with a wave of social and political unrest, including strikes, protests, peasant uprisings, and military mutinies. To quell the revolutionaries, the Tsar offered several government reforms, and that managed to satisfy them. But as the years passed, the revolutionaries grew more and more displeased by the relatively few changes made by the Tsar. Russia then transformed into a hotbed of anarchism and socialism. People were so at odds that even the RSDLP split up, this time for good, and not united in any way. In 1917, the Mensheviks took control of Petrograd, now called St. Petersburg, and set up a provincial government. A few months later, the Bolsheviks then took Petrograd from the Mensheviks during the October Revolution. A month later, a civil war began between the Communists, or the Red Army, and the anti-Communists, or the anti-Bolsheviks, called the White Army. Though the White Army was supported by the US, the UK, and other major powers, the Red Army crushed the opposition and took control of the entire country. The Bolsheviks thus became the Russian Communist Party. 2 years later, in 1924, Lenin, who had been the country's leader since the Red Army's victory, died, and was replaced with the General Secretary of the Communist Party. That would be Joseph Stalin. Life in the USSR could be considered in some ways either worse off or the same as before. Industry was now owned and managed completely by the government. Agricultural land was divided into state-run collective farms. All politics and attitudes that were not strictly communist were suppressed under the premise that the RCP represented the proletariat. Stalin was, in 2 words, ruthless and firm. He sought to destroy his political rivals, and to achieve his goals, he would utilize brutal methods including party purges, political repression of the general population, forced collectivization, labor camps, man-made famines, and forced resettlements of the population. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, with the USSR following soon after. After invading Poland, the Soviet Union occupied and annexed several other countries in Eastern Europe, until 1941 when Hitler sent his troops to invade the Soviet Union. Obviously ticked off, the Soviets soon joined the Allied forces, contributing much to the war effort. After World War II, as many Eastern European countries were left without stable governments due to the Nazis, the USSR moved on in and occupied those countries. This started the conflict between the West and the USSR that we all know today as the Cold War. The Cold War was called cold because there was never any physical fighting. Rather, it was a nuclear arms race, that is, a race to build up their supply of nuclear weapons. With the US rebuilding in Europe and Japan to expand its markets after World War II, the USSR feared that the US wanted to use its money and power to dominate Europe, eventually causing the USSR to collapse. The US, on the other hand, feared that the USSR wanted to destroy democratic and capitalist institutions because the Soviet Union was communist and had taken control of many Eastern European countries already. Not only this, but the US was afraid of the domino effect, which is the theory that once communists start taking over one country, that they would take over in other countries. To contain the spread of the USSR going further into Western Europe, the US dumped boatloads of money into rebuilding and making those countries rich again. The US also founded NATO, so that if an allied country ever felt threatened, the other countries could come to its rescue. The US also had CIA interventions in elections where communists had a chance. Anyways, as all this is going on, in 1953, Stalin died and was succeeded by Georgy Malenkov as prime minister and by Nikita Khrushchev as first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. After Stalin died, many top USSR leaders denounced some of Stalin's ways. Lavrentiy Beria, the former head of the state security apparatus and then first deputy premier, initiated a period of relative liberalization, including releasing some political prisoners, even allowing some criticism of Stalin. He was then executed. Soon after, Khrushchev emerged as a central figure and denounced Stalin and attacked some of the crimes committed by Stalin's inner circle. He furthered the de-Stalinization process by declaring amnesty for some serving prison sentences. He ended large-scale forced labor, advocated for competition rather than hostility with the West, and eased up on some restrictions and censorship. However, he also reintroduced aggressive anti-religious campaigns, closing down many houses of worship. Then, in 1958, Khrushchev became premier, gaining ultimate authority. During his reign, the Soviet Union launched the first ever artificial Earth satellite in history, and also sent the first man in space. The Berlin Wall was also created under Khrushchev. It was built to keep Germans from escaping communist-dominated East Berlin into democratic West Berlin. The 12-foot concrete wall extended for 100 miles, surrounding West Berlin, and included electrified fences and guard posts. Anyways, we'll get back to that later. The deterioration between the USSR and China, the construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and failed reforms all hurt Khrushchev's image in his country, and in 1964, when he was away on vacation, he was voted out of office. Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev. Key events during his term included the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 to stem a trend towards liberalization, achieving parity with the US on strategic nuclear weapons in 1972, and then ending that period of détente with the West by invading Afghanistan in 1979. Finally, in 1982, Brezhnev died and was replaced by KGB chief Yuri Andropov, who died 2 years later in 1984. He was then replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, who died a year later and was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. During his tenure, Gorbachev begins an anti-alcohol campaign and sets forth policies of openness and reconstruction. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan gives his famous "Tear Down This Wall" speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, calling for Gorbachev to remove the barrier dividing Germany. Some months later, Reagan and Gorbachev met again and signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles from Europe. 2 years later, the wall is completely torn down. And that same year, Soviet troops leave Afghanistan after having been there since 1979. Then, in 1991, the Congress of People's Deputies votes for the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A few months later, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus meet and sign an agreement setting up the Commonwealth of Independent States. Then, on Christmas Day of that year, Gorbachev steps down as president, and the newly formed Russian government takes over the formerly USSR offices. Nowadays, it appears that the current president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is seeking to rebuild the USSR by undermining democratic governments of former communist countries. Since the end of January this year, Russian-backed forces have launched thousands of strikes and renewed attacks on pro-European government positions deep inside Ukraine, according to One Time magazine. In addition to that, Russia has been caught trying to meddle in Western elections, hoping to destabilize Western democracies. Despite that, Putin has been seeking a bargain with the West. the US especially. Since Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, it has been beset with harsh sanctions from the West. To relieve itself of the sanctions, which has driven the economy into a recession, Russia has been begging the US to form an anti-ISIS alliance, and also pursue renewed arms control measures. But as for right now, President Trump has not really considered the specifics of any deal with Russia. And that's all the time we have left for a brief history of the USSR. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.